everyone, to this week's Cat's Eye on the Future. We're glad to hear you all this evening, and I'm sorry we've been gone the last several weeks, but with the holidays and everything, it just didn't work out to record a show. But we're back now, and we'd like to welcome back our regular guest, Kveldulfr Gundarsson, and he's going to give us a little talk tonight about herbs. So over to you, Kveldulfr.
Okay, now this is probably the first of the series, as there is a lot of information about herbs in the northern tradition, if one digs sufficiently. So I'm going to start by talking about a few basic principles of herbalism in general, before I move specifically on to the Germanic. Okay, the first and most important thing to keep in mind when doing herbal work for medicinal purposes is that these are drugs. This is very, very important to keep in mind because it's unfortunately not uncommon for people to be very casual with herbal medicines and to forget to mention them to their doctors when they're being asked what medications they're on. In fact, I heard a case presented last year of a woman who had come into her GP office with post-menstrual bleeding from the ladies' parts, which is normally not such a good sign. It's very worrying. It turned out that the woman had been taking, I believe, black cohosh, which had actually... basically, it was acting as estrogen therapy, and she was having... she had basically restored her periods, not her fertility, but she was having this bleeding because of this herbal supplement she was taking to ease the pangs of menopause, and it was very unnerving, and there would have been a huge waste of time and effort if her doctor had not been able to determine this fact and had just referred her on for investigations. Okay, so it's also important to keep in mind, again, that just because something is natural doesn't mean that if you have problems with the pharmaceutical version, that you can use the unprocessed version freely. And the example I'll use here is the red rice product, which is essentially a sort of statin. Now, some people prefer the red rice because it is natural. On the other hand, people who are intolerant to pharmaceutical statins absolutely should not ever even consider it, because these are quite powerful medicines. Now, you may ask if these are such powerful medicines, why don't we see herbs used in modern medicine more often? And the answer is actually we do. They're just processed. Useful drugs such as atropine, for instance, still comes from deadly nightshade. A great many of our current medications are actually derived from natural herbs, and some of them can be created entire in the laboratory, but some of them still have to be processed out of the herbs. And in fact, there's an increasing rush as the pharmaceutical industry looks for more and more products to sell, to investigate the use of herbs in traditional medicine, which has given us a lot of modern medications, and the plants that may be growing in less explored places, the Amazon, what have you. In fact, that's a real concern with the deforestation of the Amazon, because we could be losing a lot of potentially very vital medications we don't even know are there yet.
Is there a difference between drugs that are processed from the actual plant and those that are made artificially?
Well, usually when a drug's processed from an actual plant, and the other reason that most conventional doctors don't like herbs too much is that doctors, curiously enough, like to know what dosage of active ingredient they're actually giving a patient, especially with the, low therapeutic indication medications. And with the process stuff, will often be an extract or a recreation of 2 or 3 single components. Now, in some cases, this is not an advantage. In some cases, the mini compounds that go into a natural herb improve its bioabsorption or buffer the effects in some ways. For instance, meadowsweet contains salicylic acid, which by itself is rougher on the stomach than acetyl salicylic acid, also known as aspirin, but other components in the meadowsweet actually buffer this so that it's not as rough on your stomach as aspirin, and it's a pretty good aspirin level painkiller, and you would really have to take a fair amount of it if you're healthy to have problems. Although, obviously, somebody who is on warfarin expecting surgery in the next few weeks, or has other potential bleeding issues, shouldn't take it at all, because it also has coumarins in it, and coumarins are basically warfarin, and also rat poison.
Yeah, it could be unpleasant.
That could be unpleasant. So basically, it's almost impossible to control the precise dosage on herbal medication, because even if you're growing it in the same garden, from one year to the next, there's different amounts of sunshine, different amounts of rain, there may be other different influences on the plant, and those are going to affect the potency. It's one of the reasons why, if you're looking for first-rate plants that are native to the Mediterranean, you generally want to get them grown in hot places because they're stronger. They have more sun. They have a higher percentage of active ingredients. Now, interestingly enough, and this leads us a little bit closer to the Germanic tradition, the way our ancestors dealt with this as best they could was in the huge body of lore about the appropriate time of year and day or night to pick any given herb for medicinal usage. Angelica root, dug at midsummer when the plant's in full bloom and starting to fade back a little bit, is going to be significantly more potent than Angelica root dug in April. So we associate going out and picking Angelica with midsummer activity.
So a lot of the plant-based connections with moon phases and seasons and things may actually have had a therapeutic reasoning.
Yeah, there was a very practical use, and our forebears, I think, understood it in what a modern Western heathen might call that dual perspective. On the one hand, there's the purely physical, the amount of light the plant's getting, the amount of time, if it's a root plant, it's had to store up. Most root plants you dig in the autumn because they're all ready for the winter. They have stored up pretty much their highest concentration of active compounds. They've got the starch to hold them through the winter. And they're at their absolute best. You pick them in spring and they're kind of played out. They need to get some growth and get some more nutrition in. Angelica is a rare exception, because if you wait till autumn, that plant's long dead. It's probably, unless it's a first or second year, it's probably rotted in the ground. But if the plant has come to full maturity, it just doesn't last past summer until you dig it and dry it. And let me just say, by the way, dry Angelica root is a very common herb. Anyone who's ever drunk a good brand of gin, like Bombay Sapphire, will be familiar with it. Apparently, fresh Angelica root is really, really poisonous, so don't eat it. Which leads me on to another aspect of practical herbalism, whether you're using it for medicine or spiritual purpose, anytime you're ingesting it or rubbing it on your person as an ointment or whatever. It is a very, very good idea to get either the most recent book on herbalism you can to check the safety and effectiveness, or just go online, check out possible adverse effects. The Mayo Clinic has an excellent section on their website on the herbs that are becoming accepted into the pharmacopoeia, what research has been done on them, and what possible problems there may be. And we're always discovering things. When I started herbalism, comfrey, which is a very commonly used herb, has been for probably thousands of years. Very good for healing bruises, broken bones, strains, what have you. It used to be back in the 1980s, it would be tossed around like candy for internal ingestion. And then there were a couple of incidents when some fool drank just an insane amount of comfrey tea over a very long period of time and trashed their livers because some of the alkaloids in comfrey, one in particular, are not so good for you if you take a huge amount over a prolonged period of time. And so most herbalists will now err on the side of caution and not prescribe comfrey for internal use.
Well, I know that there was also a big problem when it was just suddenly overnight taken off the shelves as tea, and you couldn't get was because that was an easy way to buy it, even to use externally. And we had to start growing it and finding people who were growing it.
Yeah, fortunately, comfrey is insanely easy to grow.
Yeah, which people discovered.
Yeah, if you get a chunk of root, in fact, you'll have comfrey everywhere, whether you want it or not. It's happily a very vigorous plant, and grows in a wide range of climates. Northern Europe, but it grows anywhere in the States from Dallas on northward.
But there was a lot of controversy when that was just abruptly, I think it was actually the Federal Drug Administration in the U.S. took it off all the shelves instead of just putting a warning label or something on it. I'm afraid it made people a little less cautious than they should be when it came to other things, because, well, if they're going to ban comfrey and it's not really that dangerous, then then there's a tendency to assume that everything else is just safe no matter what you do with it.
Yeah, and if you think about it, comfrey is a whole lot better for your liver than paracetamol, for instance.
Which is
paracetamol, which is Tylenol.
Yeah.
Which is in overdose absolutely devastating. We lose people to accidental paracetamol poisoning every year, but it's still over the counter.
Mind you, and everything we discuss in this show, by the way, is for educational purposes only. This is, we're not telling anyone what they should or shouldn't do, but I'm not advocating, by the way, going out and drinking a lot of comfrey. I'm just saying...
In one case, I am telling people one thing they should do, which is if you're taking any herbal medicines or supplements, make sure your doctor knows that you're taking them.
Okay, now
I'm telling you.
Okay, but that's a good question. So, since a lot of doctors will then say, well, we don't think you should take anything like that. Because I've experienced that myself, not recently. I mean, we have a very good GP here, and she just wants to know so she can factor it in to other medications. But with so many doctors simply saying, I don't know anything about that, you shouldn't take those. Yeah,
I mean, unfortunately, in most modern medical education, even at, very progressive, forward-thinking schools, there is this tendency to lump herbalism along with, homeopathy or healing by fuzzy bunny meditation or, whatever not so plausible thing you want to lump it with. And I, in fact, in classes, I several times had to say, herbalism really is pharmacology. The problem, of course, as I mentioned, is just that it's fairly uncontrolled pharmacology. Sometimes a benefit, sometimes a problem.
But the perception ought to be, because traditional herbalism, which I'm sure we're eventually getting to, in almost all cultures comes with chants or, would sound like spells to, sometimes actually are, but, to a Western trained, particularly older physician, this just sounds like, ooh-ee, ooh-ah, bing, bang, well, I'm going to call it witch doctor. And can you explain sort of, is there an interaction there?
Okay, well, I don't think the modern medical institution really thinks about that. I don't think most practicing herbalists, unless they're also working within a specific religious or magical tradition as part of it, are inclined to chant. They're more likely to write you a prescription for, tablets of some sort, or thus and such a dose of tincture, blah, blah, and send you home to take it yourself like any medication. Now, One interesting thing, looking back just a little farther in time in this regard, though, is that the tension between herbalism and, if you like, official medicine, establishment medicine, I'm not knocking it, I'm a medical student myself, but one of the issues since at least the 16th century has been this sort of dichotomy between the highly trained in the system, established belief, medicine completely in the hands of the doctors and their fees, and herbalism, at least from Culpeper's time on, has tended to be more the medicine of the people. Well, it was, available. Half the most useful plants in these islands grow right along the roadside in any field that you haven't grazed to the ground. In fact, Culpeper wrote his herbal specifically to give the average English peasant, what have you, a chance to medicate themselves without, trucking down to London and paying a huge amount of money to be seen by a professional doctor whose treatments at that time, honestly, probably weren't really as good as the herbalism, which is not the case now. But the point is that there has been this conflict going for quite a while, and it's still is going.
Yeah, I mean, I know the same thing happens in the history of midwifery to a degree.
Yeah. Now, and again, as a healthcare practitioner, I would a whole lot rather prescribe someone pharmaceutical atropine if they needed it than I would make a preparation of deadly nightshade for them. Some of these things you really, really do not want to be randomizing. Now, the way they had ways of handling that back in the day, and I'm pleased to have a manuscript of notes from Harvard Medical School circa 1919-1920, which explains how to make your own digitalis and test it for strength. Unfortunately, this involves killing off 2 or 3 frogs in the process, and I kind of like frogs. If there weren't better options, I'd do it, but we have happily much better options.
But that sort of explains, though, some of the changes, because a doctor in, like, my great aunt who trained at that period would have had to have been killing frogs as part of her learning to use the pharmacopoeia.
Yes, and digitalis itself is actually one of everyone's sterling examples of something that had been used a long time for a certain thing in folk medicine that turned out to be terrifically effective for the desired purpose.
And what does digitalis do, and what is its pharmaceutical come in?
Yeah, digitalis it's a cardiac drug, and traditionally, it was used for what they called dropsy, which was essentially signs of what some people would call, or used to call back in my father's day, backward heart failure. So, you would get people in this having backwards heart failure, congestive heart failure, and they would get terrible swelling in their lower limbs, possibly even fluid in their stomach, because everything's plugged up, and eventually you get ascites as if it were the liver that were the primary problem, and so forth. And digitalis actually strengthens the heart, keeps things moving along, increases the contraction. Probably don't want the full details on how it does that.
No, but it just... So this would have been a condition that I saw a lot when I was a child, but I don't see that much now, of elderly people who would be very, very swollen and moving very slowly, and they sort of dropped onto the couch or the chair. Yeah,
and good odds that was your old congestive heart failure. And again, we have lots of nice things now, but they still include digitalin from foxgloves.
And
like what grows right outside in our garden.
But I think foxglove is another example, though, of something that is a very old drug that is very traditional, but also if it's one of the advantages of being able to use it in modern medicine that's been done through the pharmacy is the dosage, because I think it used to kill people, didn't it?
Yeah, it was a very risky drug to use. It's got a low therapeutic index. The therapeutic index is that space between when the drug becomes effective and when it becomes toxic.
Yeah.
So something like warfarin, for instance, has a minute therapeutic index. Something like cannabis has a therapeutic index that's so high it can't even be measured. Pretty much everything else falls somewhere in between.
So with cannabis, you have almost no known fatal or extreme...
Yeah, if you want, nobody has ever even established a lethal dose 50 for rodents in it. If you want to kill a rodent with cannabis, which is normally how we start by determining these things, you'd have to get a 20-pound brick and drop it from a high building.
So it's probably worse than salt, then, I'd say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you can kill yourself with salt a lot faster. But in any case, back to the more immediately relevant issues of Germanic herbalism and its evolution here. A few minutes ago, you mentioned the traditional uses of various chant spells and prayers in the preparation of herbal concoctions. And in fact, we see that in the Leech books. These instructions to recite, to repeat. Sometimes it's prayers, sometimes it's heathen spells, sometimes it's a weird melange of both, which we see quite a bit in the Leech books. But all of these, again, they have a obviously spiritual effect. The idea is to fill the preparation with this particular magical or spiritual power, the blessing of the gods, whatever you're calling in this particular case. But they also, like the phases of the moon and the time of day, serve a very important practical purpose, which is if you live in a time before watches or even clocks are particularly common, you need to know how long to cook or otherwise prepare your herbal preparations for optimum effectiveness. And it's interesting because they had these timing devices, which were also powerful spells and prayers. So really, they were getting the practical effect, they were getting the spiritual effect. And we mustn't leave out what people often scornfully call the placebo effect, which seems to be, as far as anyone's guess goes, and really almost anyone's guess is as good as anyone else, because researchers spend a lot more time trying to rule out placebo effect than to figuring out how it actually works. But if you see a spiritual practitioner in whom you have confidence going to this effort, reciting these powerful spells or prayers or charms over your medication while it's cooking, chances are you're going to respond better than if they just handed you a bowl of glop. And it's amazing how detailed some of these instructions are and how relevant it is. There's a number of the Anglo-Saxon ones which state specifically that the preparation should be made in a pot of a particular metal or stirred with a rod or spoon of a particular metal or what have you. And of course, our forebears, probably didn't know that cooking something in an iron pot for quite a while will get some iron into it. And if it's being made, say, for a young woman who's green sick, who has that typical young woman mild anemia, the iron salts are going to do her the world of good as well as the rest of the tonic. They were not real clear on the exact chemistry, but they were very clear on the empirical effects. They noticed when things work.
Well, they would also have noticed that there are a lot of connections between herbalism, traditional herbalism, cooking, and even dyeing, I believe, particularly all of which would have been done in the family pot.
Yes,
and there are extreme changes that can be noticed if you say are dyeing between a copper pot and an iron pot.
yes.
So there's some really obvious, like it completely changes the color.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought of dyeing as a possible source for the information, but I think you probably have something to it, and there might, you might have even seen a change in color in the brew.
Well, and you would have in cooking as well, is what I'm saying. There's some things, if you cook them in an iron pot, they turn a different color or they change flavors.
Right. Yeah, that sounds extremely plausible to me.
Because weren't women often the traditional, at least herbalists in the home?
Yes, this actually, you'd mentioned cooking and dyeing. Really, the art that it seems to be most strongly associated with herbalism, and particularly magical herbalism, is brewing. Now, both healing and brewing are in an interesting social class among the Germanic people in terms of gender things, because most of the time they seem to have been a female art. And there is this very pervasive, very old archetype in the Germanic about the wise woman who is a brewer and can be either the healer or the poisoner. And we see figures, Grimhild in Volsunga, with her magical brews of love and forgetfulness and what have you, is probably, one of the best examples of this. But it's all through the literature and indeed the histories and laws in the continental Germanic peoples and the Anglo-Saxons as well as the Norse. Now, healing and brewing were both primarily female art, but oddly enough, there doesn't seem to have been any shame involved with a man doing them. After the conversion, we start seeing male healers with more often, they show up in the sagas, with much no conflict. And crucially, in Lokasenna, where Ygr has brewed the ale for the feast, when Loki gets around to having a go at Ygr, if there were an issue with men doing the brewing, that would have been a prime time. I don't think Loki could have missed a target like that. Hey, Ygr, you're a fag, you're brewing the beer. Nope, he doesn't say that.
This occurred after the conversion?
We started seeing male healers. We started seeing men taking over the profession of healing, at least to some degree after the conversion. You notice all of the English stuff, our leech books are actually written down by monks, but we also start seeing male healers in the sagas.
I wondered because at that point, monks would have been, even in Southern Europe, monks would have been healing already. So I just wondered if that was a sort of a cultural thing that.
Yeah, I think in England, that very much was. I think the monastic orders came up from the south, brought in fact the extensive by that time classical pharmacopoeias, texts on medicines. Which makes things a lot more difficult when you're trying to figure out what elements of something in one of the leech books are authentic Germanic and what were brought in from the south. And some of the southern stuff rooted, pretty early. For instance, we think about mandrakes. Now, mandrakes will grow in northern Europe with a bit of shelter. I've grown them in my garden in Ireland. I've seen a magnificent plant in full fruit up in Cruciminta on Gotland, right by the ocean there. But you don't tend to see them in the wild. I'm not sure they grow wild this far north at all. Even if they do grow in the tame and cultivate okay here, as long as you can keep their feet dry. But so the chances are that the mandrake was not really known to your hypothetical, relatively, culturally isolated, pure Germanic heathen. But it was a big deal in the South. It was a huge, big deal for all the peoples around the Mediterranean, and it was seen down there as a, very, very, very heavy magic herb, not to mention an anesthetic. Don't try this at home, kids, really. But that sense of almost creepy mysticism that goes with the mandrake got in pretty early, and we see it in the Leech books, and we see it, just absolutely pervading extensively both continental German and Scandinavian, and I think also English folklore.
Oh, yeah. And I would think it would be hard to have some things that are like completely pure Germanic, just because you have trading in the Bronze Age with the Greeks, for example. Yeah. So there's going to be a certain amount of interaction and influence both ways.
Exactly. So, but I think we can say that the mandrakes more or less came up along with the conversion, but they got deeply, deeply socked into our spiritual life. The Germans tended to take them and wrap them up in silken caskets and use them for family amulets. All sorts of interesting things you can do with them.
I think I would compare that in some ways to the modern, since the 18th century, practice of giving the Tomte his tobacco.
Yes. Yeah, people adapt. People adapt. People incorporate changing aspects of daily life into their understanding of the other world. So that's the case with some of these herbs. And if there's anyone out there, and I know there's a fair few of ye because I've talked to a lot of ye, Germanic heathens who are also actually trained or professional herbalists, you probably, as well as using the herbs that your ancestors could find in Northern Europe, also use imported herbs like turmeric, for instance, and think none the less of it.
You have been listening to part 1 of Cat's Eye on the Future. We'll return to the show right after these short messages. Do you have questions? The cards have answers. If you would like a personal reading with Melodi, just go to my website, melodipsychicreadings.com. That's Melodi with an I, psychicreadings.com, for information, or email me at melodireader@gmail.com. Readings are available using Skype, phone, email, or even in person if you are lucky to live in Ireland. Why not find out what special messages the cards have just for you and book a private reading today? We now return to part 2 of Cat's Eye on the Future. And turmeric is interesting because this is a bit of a side issue, but I think it's fascinating when it comes to herbs, and you may want to go into it more in another show, but the idea that one needs to have the whole plant.
Yes. It was discovered that the crucial ingredient in turmeric was seems to be pretty good for a number of things, including, if I recall correctly, cardiac, cholesterol, certainly arthritis. And the pharmaceutical companies went, woo-hoo, we can sell this. And then they found out that if you just extracted that ingredient pure, you had no bioavailability. You'd give it to a patient, it push right through them not doing anything. So they messed about, and they had a bit of success mingling it with, I believe it was a black pepper oil or resin, and finally they just went back and took the extracted resin from the plant and put it back together with the active compound, and then it worked. Yes, if you're using turmeric, by the way, just be aware that it's got a short shelf life, and it may have been sitting on the shelf of your local spice store for a while.
What is the amount of time?
I think by 6 months you're not going to get anything but flavor and color out of it.
So this is one case where it might be better to buy a a prescribed brand, or do they have that?
I have not seen a prescription preparation yet.
That's interesting. So they're just really not interested.
I think they are, but I guess they have not yet perfected it. Or I could be wrong. I mean, it's possible that they've come out with something more recently of which I wasn't aware.
Because there was one of the herbs that you were needing that
I think you can get curcumin products, come to think of it.
You probably can.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to get off topic on that. We can return to that another time. But just I thought that was interesting that there are times when the whole plant really is necessary.
Yes, and again, that's the good thing about herbalism. It's one of the things that's giving the medicinal cannabis people fits, because again, it's incredibly complex. There's at least two, probably three, and possibly quite a few more compounds in the plant, which have medicinal effects. They have very separate and distinct medicinal effects. Everyone knows what THC does. But the big thing now is CBD, which is not particularly hallucinatory and is a significant anti-inflammatory and anticonvulsant. Because the plant has been, until fairly recently, not terribly well explored, there's a lot we don't know. For instance, there's this whole controversy about, does smoking too much dope cause guys to grow moobs, or doesn't it? And it's something you grow up hearing, smoke too much dope, you'll grow moobs. Well, there have been a few studies done on it, and some of the studies said, no way, no hint of it, and a couple of them said, yeah, it does look like this might be a thing. Now, at the time, they were dealing with people who had been, regular smokers from whatever they could buy on the street. They were getting different strains with different levels of compounds. It's plausible because the closest relation to cannabis, the other plant in the family, is hops, and we know hops have a massive estrogenic effect.
Hence the beer.
Yeah, hence the classic beer belly and moobs.
Yes.
But because there are at this point so many different strains of cannabis with radically different chemical profiles, that makes doing a decent set of clinical trials a good bit more difficult. But fortunately, we can now do this. Israel in particular is putting a lot of effort into it as it gets legalized in the States. So, 10 years from now, we'll actually know this plant and really know what we're doing with it. Fortunately, near infinite therapeutic index.
Yeah. So not.
And incidentally, for those of you who wonder, why is he rambling off on the topic of dope when this is supposed to be more or less Germanic? Cannabis was a pretty significant herb to our ancestors. It's hemp. We wouldn't have had all those good checkered sails on our Viking ships without hemp. We used it for rope. We used it for bowstrings. We used it for medicine. One of the Oseberg women, I believe the younger one, actually had a leather amulet bag around her neck when she was buried that had a number of hemp seeds in it. Now, you can question whether this was because hemp was holy as a fiber plant or whether it was holy as an entheogen, as a herb which assisted communication with the gods. Because flax is certainly a fiber plant and certainly was considered holy in its own right. But cannabis was already well known as a medicine in Anglo-Saxon areas in continental Germany, and the Norse had a lot of interaction with the Middle East, where the medicinal strains had been going for a very long time. I doubt they brought much back with them because the stronger medicinal cannabis tends to be real short and bushy, and that was the opposite of what you wanted if you were growing hemp in Northern Europe. You wanted long fibers for weaving, but nonetheless, it probably had a much lower content than the highly bred medicinal strains of today. And it didn't last long. If you made an ale with the stuff by winter nights, it, probably wouldn't be anything besides ale by spring unless you kept it out in that great freezer that is the Scandinavian outdoors during the winter.
So it was used in brewing?
It was probably used in brewing. It was most commonly used medicinally as an ointment. And indeed, the active ingredients are quite lipophilic and apparently absorbs through the skin pretty well. So this is probably one of the ingredients in the various mystical ointments which survived right up into the early modern period as the classic, quote, witch's flying ointment, unquote. And certainly whether cannabis was a significant thing among them or not, though it probably was, because apparently the resin of the flowers is extremely sticky, and the only way to get it off is with butter or oil, which causes it to sink into the hands, which means if you're out there harvesting the stuff, well, there's probably a reason Norwegians still occasionally use the phrase out in the hemp field to mean out in La La Land. But what we have a bit more solid evidence for is the use of henbane for an entheogenic brew. Now, henbane of the what I would call the very heavy and also the don't try this at home historical medicinal plants has the best therapeutic index, is probably, if one must use it, don't. Unless you are actually a seriously trained professional medical herbalist, don't even think about it. But it is the least toxic of the lot, and it creates, apparently, that giddy flying sensation. We know it was used in brewing in Germany. In fact, there's various questions as to whether the Pils beer is actually named after the henbane, the Pils plant. And that's kind of a discussed thing, but it's certainly the local legend. They probably were using it. There's a Danish burial of a woman whom everyone refers to as the Fyrkat witch, because she had a number of interesting items with her when she was planted. I believe one of those nifty iron distaffs with the decoration, which may very well have been used as Sather Gondars, or in the case of the larger ground-planted ones, Sather staves, and a bunch of bones and such, and a load of henbane seeds. Now, maybe she just had them because she'd been using them medicinally for herself or others, but given all the spooky stuff she was planted with, I think it very likely that it would fall into that category.
So henbane has a spooky association.
Henbane has a very spooky associations. It's all, it's pretty common throughout the world for the most poisonous plants, the most venomous snakes, what have you, to be understood as the items of greatest power. And I think that's one of the things we see with this dual vision of the woman, of the house mother or Hallfrau, as potentially both the healer and the poisoner. This is an entire field of power which can be used or it can be misused. And likewise, you see plants like mandrakes, henbane, deadly nightshade, and you tend to think of these as the plants with more mystical power as well.
I keep listening to this and I keep remembering a paragraph, an introduction to a book I have on traditional Scottish dyeing, that where she's trying only to use dye plants from really, really rural Scotland. And she points out something that I'm not sure you'd know more archaeologically, but the average family in Scotland, and I am presuming in the Northland as well, would only have one pot for the most part for cooking. And you used it for cooking, you used it for dyeing, you used it for medicinal purposes. And the concept, things were washed out, but there tended to be some cross-contamination. And she mentions this in the book several times. I mean, a large hall or something, I'm sure would have more than one pot.
I mean, look at the load of stuff the Oseberg Queen had.
But the average,
she's a queen, yeah.
Yeah, she's a queen. The average farmstead, how many pots did they have? So if you're there's this collision almost between healing and poison.
Yeah.
Or, even cooking and poisoning, or, it would be very easy to accidentally poison your family.
Yeah.
If you only have 1 or 2 pots.
Yeah, I think you'd have to be pretty badly off only to have 1 pot, but that's just a guess, but certainly in the Gotlandic burials, people are planted with loads of them.
Okay.
Vessels were a big deal, so... It seems reasonable that most people weren't stuck with 1 pot. Maybe if you were, really poor. But
there also wasn't the understanding as much, at least not in Scotland, and I'm asking, not using a cooking pot. When you learn to dye these days, dyeing yarns and making colors out of fabric and stuff, they're very, very clear on you buy a separate set of pots that you only use for that.
Yeah, and I don't think they'd have been as clear on that one, no.
And there is the potential for cross-contamination there. And there would be, I would think, if you were making medicines.
Yeah, and the other thing is that this... I mentioned the woman as healer, poisoner, but in the Germanic view, it was actually kind of a 3-point role, because those skills also went with being, a sorceress, a wise woman, whatever term you wish to use.
Did it flow into midwifery at all, or is that just not known?
I would think that it would have had to flow into midwifery. Any time, I think any culture, midwifery is going to be such an important part of medical care, and particularly in cultures where medical care appears to be dominated by women, because certainly there are all sorts of folk charms, for a healthy pregnancy, charms for conception, charms for bearing, charms to, fix up your kid's rickets or whatever, although that's moving more into pediatrics, I guess. But you would certainly see a lot of overlap with the midwifery there.
And you don't have a separation yet that you tend to get. I think it's more like 17th, 18th century, where for a while there, it's almost like midwifery and pregnancy are not seen as part of medicine.
Yeah, no, it would not. That would not be the case. When you think about how much of folk magic is geared towards, as I said, conception, good pregnancy, safe birthing, that would be a very, very, very significant part of Northern medicine. Unfortunately, we don't have so much written down about it, and this leads to one of the biggest problems with doing herbalism as a Northern heathen, because there's not all that much information in the Old Norse sources. The Anglo-Saxon sources have loads of information, but there's also that cross-contamination thing going. Very limited selection in both the prose and the poetic literature. So except for a few, terrifically, incredibly important plants, which I add are also some of our best general medicinals or medicinal foods, such as apples and leeks, we don't really know much about the actual Viking pharmacopoeia, except what we can piece together from basically folklore, folk usages, and comparison with the Anglo-Saxon and the occasional medical bits that get written down in Germany. But most of what we know about Germanic herbalism is from more modern folklore. Now there are some things that stay pretty constant. We know in both the Anglo-Saxon and the few references we get in Old Norse, Ointments with a butter or oil base were very, very popular, and you can, they're easy to make, and most things you can get pretty good absorption through the skin. They all, we've discussed brewing at length. There wasn't so much in inhaling of smoke. The whole concept of smoking as such had not yet arrived in Europe. But it was not uncommon to, for instance, smudge one's house with particularly juniper, sometimes sulfur, salt, gunpowder, which had the effect of both driving out purely spiritual evil influences, and particularly the juniper, actually getting a little bit of disinfection going there. Juniper has some antibacterial properties, and if you make like a 19th century Norwegian housewife and soak a load of the stuff in the barrel, in the pot before you go mopping out your house for New Year's, you will drive out both in any untoward trolls and such hanging about, discourage them, but you'll also drive out all the various nasty little wights that lurk in cracks and corners and crevices and lungs and other places.
Were herbs sometimes, or medicinal, sometimes used in saunas?
They almost certainly were. On the continent, we know the Scythians were doing the hemp sauna thing. It's very, very possible that the Germanic tribes that interacted with them might have used it. I can't think of any historical references, although certainly birch, the use of the birch leaves for the whipping to improve the circulation, pleasantly scent the sauna. Again, maybe a bit of disinfection and such along with the sauna. That probably been doing that as long as there's been sauna.
Getting back to the ointments, I can easily...
But it would work. And one thing that really seems to have gone with magic, at least in the sagas, was steeping up in a very large pot these great magical messes. It was the steam and smoke that seemed to carry the power. Hence, embarrassing as it is, I have to admit that the whole witchy cauldron thing really probably actually did derive from heathen practice, along with the black cats, which also show up as companions to the sort of nasty people that would practice Sather and stuff like that.
I remember when you first saw that, and you were just so almost upset, because all those years.
All those years, but your Icelandic witch would have her cauldron, and she or he might well have a black cat, or as in one case, a whole pack of black cats. Sounds suitable for scaring off a tribe of well-armed, healthy Viking men with pitchforks and torches when they came to burn him out, as one does when one's neighbor has been practicing Sather.
Sounds like some large cats.
I think they were probably Norske skull cats.
Yeah, but bigger than the little herd of black cats we have downstairs terrorizing mice.
They may or may not have been real cats. The word used for them is very ambiguous and could suggest that they were actual cats, that they were magical constructs, that they were spirits. It's one of those very, very generic words in Old Norse.
So, in general, then, if somebody wants to do Germanic herbalism, it's a little difficult to do it without just primarily relying on folklore, and maybe again accepting that some of the stuff from the South had become so integrated that it became essentially part of the lore. Yeah,
I mean, I use mandrakes myself, because they're just so integrated. But it's largely folklore. Unfortunately, the best books on the topic are pretty much all in Scandinavian languages. Sorry.
Weren't you working on one for a while?
Yes, and when I finish it, eventually, then there will be a very large book on Germanic herbalism.
Yeah, is there anything else you'd like to mention this evening?
Okay, well, I think this has been kind of our introductory discussion on the concept of herbalism.
Okay.
And in future, I'd like to do some interviews where we go more deeply into some of the better documented herbs, how they were used, how they were perceived, what their place in both the if you like, the spiritual worlds in the Middlegarth was.
That sounds really good. We've gone like not quite an hour, and I think this is probably a good time to break on the subject, let people think about it, maybe go is there any books you could recommend for people that might want to look at this?
The single overall best book in English is Mrs. M. Greaves' A Modern Herbal. It's originally a 2-volume deal. There are 1-volume editions out there. This was written in the 1930s, I believe, when an awful lot of herbs, as raw herbs, were still in the British pharmacopoeia. And Mrs. Greaves also gives dosages for things you would never expect to readily find dosages for. She also goes into a lot of the folklore. And aside from occasional little baubles, usually pretty minor, she's a very good source in that regard, particularly the English folklore, though she does not neglect Scandinavia and the continent altogether. So this would be what I would consider the core book. Now, the only thing about this book is it was written in the 1930s, so there are a lot of things we know about both toxicity and effectiveness that wasn't known then. So before you go ingesting or rubbing on or inhaling or otherwise messing about with herbs, it's a good idea to get a modern second opinion on them.
Okay. Well, on that note, I want to thank you very much for coming this evening and talking to us, and we'll look forward to those future lectures on the various herbs and getting a little more specific.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. And I want to thank everybody for being with us this evening, and we'll see you back next time here at Cat's Eye on the Future. You have been listening to Cat's Eye on the Future, the show where we take a look at what's coming up in your world and your future. Join us again next time for another episode of Cat's Eye on the Future.